Hello, and welcome to Portfolio Matters, weekly markets checklist, week 180. And what a couple of weeks it has been. Donald Trump seems to be attempting to change the world every day, and we will be going through the macro data at speed this week and concentrating on what's happening in the world. But before we get into it, Richard will read the disclaimer.
Thank you, Keith. Everything discussed during the Portfolio Matters podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. Listeners should be aware that we will be discussing securities that we own or have a financial interest in. Please do your own research or consult a professional investment advisor before making any decisions regarding topics mentioned on the show. A full disclaimer can be found at the end. Let's get into it, Keith.
Well, first of all, the news. So, so far, the US has imposed tariffs of 25% on Mexico and Canada, and then 10% tariffs on China. The tariffs on Canada were lowered to 10% for Canadian oil, and the US oil industry requires heavy Canadian oil to blend into its refineries. So that tax will affect the US oil industry. Now, the moment he announced that, there were negotiations with Canada and Mexico and a bad reaction from the stock market, and the tariffs on Canada and Mexico have been paused for a month. So we don't know whether those will eventually come into effect or not. The tariffs with China remain in effect. And remember that during the last Trump presidency, he imposed tariffs on China, which remain in effect. So the extra 10% tariffs on China bring total tariffs on Chinese imports to around 15%. Trump has also threatened the EU with tariffs pretty soon, and he seems quite firm about that. So we're waiting to see what will happen. And this morning, the FT is reporting that Trump has imposed tariffs of 25% on steel and aluminium imports from all around the world. Now, China has responded to US tariffs with a 15% tax on US coal and LNG imports, a 10% tax on large engine US cars, and regulatory probes into US tech companies. Trump has not taken that very well. There was going to be talks about the ending a trade war, averting a trade war between the US and China, and those have been put on pause. So it looks like the US and China are entering a trade war of some kind. So the other news of the past couple of weeks was that Chinese AI company DeepSeek released its R1 model, which has similar performance to ChatGPT, but was developed at a fraction of the cost using the previous generation of NVIDIA microchips. And so that undermined the previous narrative that AI was going to be dominated by the big US tech companies, leading to sharp falls in the shares of the Mag 7. We have a section on DeepSeek coming up. And elsewhere, France finally passed a budget which will tighten the deficit by 50 billion euros and cut it to only 5.4% of GDP, still way above the EU's maximum threshold. Elsewhere, macro data, the ECB cut rates by 25 basis points to 2.9%. The Bank of England cut interest rates by 25 basis points to 4.5% in a unanimous vote, with two of the members actually voting for a 50 basis point cut. The Bank of England halved its growth forecast for the UK for 2025 to 0.75%, and it also warned that inflation would rise to 3.7% later in the year, primarily because of higher gas prices, but also due to mandated rises in bus fares and household water bills. They also warned that UK unemployment would rise to 4.8%. So Richard has been dead right so far, and the UK is facing stagflation. The Fed held rates at 4.5%. US ISM Services PMI came in soft, and actually a lot of the US data has come in slightly soft. So the euphoria in the US economy, which followed Donald Trump's election, seems to be fading a bit. And what has Donald Trump been up to in the past 2 weeks? Now, this is very difficult to keep up with. And so this is not an exhaustive list. Our frontispiece this week is his press conference with Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu, in which he outlined a plan in which the US takes over Gaza at the end of the war. All 2 million Gazans would then be expelled, or previously been expelled, to elsewhere in the Middle East to perfect new homes. None of this seems remotely plausible or realistic. Richard, have you got any idea what he's planning, what he's doing by saying this?
I have no idea, Keith. Often he comes out with these rather extreme statements as a negotiating position, doesn't he? But I know that listening to the Radio 4 this morning, he's repeated this
Yeah.
again. And so if it's a negotiating position, he's holding on to it very firmly. It strikes me as being, in fact, extraordinarily dangerous thing to be doing, as well as internationally illegal. And if it were a negotiating position, I would expect to try and understand what that ultimately what he's aiming for. I don't know what he's aiming for here.
I think we've had an extensive discussion about this on the Discord, and one of the points people has made is that he is resetting expectations. So after this, the breadth of possible outcomes for Gaza has been significantly expanded.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the most charitable explanation we can put on it. Elsewhere, he has offered 8 months redundancy to any federal workers willing to accept it in an effort to shrink the size of the federal government. Now, as of the deadline of the 6th of February, around 60,000 workers had accepted it, but the judge has now paused the plan until a hearing today, and it is not at all clear that that is legal. So there is a cap of $25,000 on the maximum redundancy pay available to US federal workers, and the 8-month redundancy offer would breach that. So, like a lot of the things he's doing, it's not clear what the legalities are. He's also appeared to be in the process of dissolving the US foreign aid agency, USAID, in its current form and making it a subsidiary of the State Department and therefore of US foreign policy. But once again, a judge has issued a temporary restraining order blocking the Trump administration from putting 2,200 USAID staff on leave. Trump has stated that he intends to shrink USAID from 10,000 employees to 611. He's also frozen all foreign aid, including to Ukraine. His very controversial picks for various senior departmental offices all have been passed by Congress. So that's Pete Hegseth for the Defense Department, Robert F. Kennedy, the vaccine skeptic, to Department of Health and Human Services, and Tulsi Gabbard to National Security. The Department of Justice has fired 24 officials involved in the prosecution of the January the 6th rioters and has demanded the names of the FBI agents involved in that prosecution process. So he is politicizing the judiciary. Richard, your thoughts on what he's up to?
I have just literally before we started, Keith, read a very disturbing article that likens him to Hitler in the early 1930s.
Well, he's certainly ruling like a monarch, not like a president. And the Democrats don't seem to be pushing back effectively against anything. And his own Congress is supine. They're full of sycophants.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think there's the difficulty is it's hard to pigeonhole it, what he's doing. Some of the things, so USAID appears to be an organisation out of control from what you read about what it's been doing. There's that if that is the case, there's a justification for curtailing its activities. But the way he does it is with a sledgehammer as opposed to with nuance. There is a method, but basically he says knock it down and see what hurts,
Yes.
and then put back in place what hurts, and the rest of it you don't need. And that's clearly what the strategy he's following. It's a rough and ready strategy. It can be quite effective. It can be very dangerous. There doesn't appear to be any sort of coherence that's coming out of it at the moment. So, but it's causing huge waves of chaos.
Yeah.
Which of itself is unsafe. One of the things that sort of particularly got me actually was his attack on the International Criminal Court. Now, neither Israel nor America are signatories to the International Criminal Court, which is their choice, but 150 odd countries are, and that's their choice. And it's not appropriate for him effectively to unilaterally sanction the International Criminal Court that 150 countries want to have. And I think that's a flavour of where he is, and if that's where he is and where he's going to go, then I think he's very dangerous, much more dangerous than he was in his first term.
Well, I totally agree with that. What I disagree with you is that on USAID, and that he twists the narrative and he describes things in extreme terms, and we know that he really exaggerates the kind of the crime/problems of his opponents. And so the things he's said about USAID, I'm very unsure how much of that I'll believe.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point, Keith. I mean, there's a sort of one source of information at the moment, really, isn't there? And so it's something I knew nothing about until it became a headline 2 weeks ago. So I have no prior knowledge of it. So it's, as you say, it's very hard to understand what the truth really is.
The thing, in summary, though, he is firing from the hip in all directions. It's not clear that there's a coherent plan between a lot of this stuff. So, the Gaza plan in particular. And what he's doing is creating a lot of political and economic uncertainty. And that is bad for the world economy.
He's creating chaos. The only good thing, I'm not sure you could talk about good things coming out of it, but one thing that I think will come out of it is that Europe will finally get its act together on defence spending and defending itself as a consequence of this.
I hope you're right, Richard, but I have less confidence in that than you do. So you've seen Ursula von der Leyen has been talking about relaxing the 3% deficit target in order to allow Europeans to increase defense spending.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder whether the Germans will be happy with that. And it again will expose the dysfunctionality of the Eurozone.
Yeah. I mean, you're right, Keith. It's by no means a done deal.
So moving on to the data, this is US interest rates. So the Fed paused, and as long as the US economy remains strong, the path of interest rates is slowly down from here, but not much further. The UK cut rates to 4.5% despite raising the inflation expectations for this year. So they're saying that the underlying economy is weakening, but inflation will rise because of primarily energy prices. We'll show you the gas price later. It is not good. EU cut rates 2.9%. And the Eurozone economy is weak, and the ECB is expecting inflation to come right down this year. So tariffs that US has put on China will primarily affect electronics and machinery and will disrupt supply chains for US manufacturers. The new tariffs are additive and effectively bring tariffs on Chinese imports to around 15%. Now, last time, Chinese manufacturers and exporters moved a lot of their operations to Southeast Asia and Mexico to avoid the tariffs, and you can see that here. So last time, there was a big drop in exports from China and a rise in exports from Vietnam, Mexico, and Taiwan. Now, I read that most of the easy relocations of production have already occurred, and it will be more difficult to adapt this time. Tariffs are more likely to be effective. Now, it's very odd that Trump picked on his key allies, primarily Canada and Mexico, as targets for the tariffs when you look at the size of the trade deficits with other countries, the ones that really stand out as a percentage or size of their economies are Taiwan and Vietnam. So Canada is the dotted line, and Vietnam red line, and Ireland, Taiwan. Most of Canada's exports are essential oil. But when you look at who is most exposed to the US in terms of the percentage of exports that go to the US, is Canada and Mexico. And therefore, the US has most leverage with those countries in order to make a deal. Now, this surprised me. Actually, when you look at US tariffs on their most favored nations, US tariffs are actually really low currently. UK's are higher. So the US is not actually starting from high tariffs. Like his speech about Gaza, the speech Trump made when he was imposing tariffs on Canada was similarly bizarre and seemed to suggest that he would like Canada to become part of the 51st state that there's been pushback in Canada. So I have prepared a long segment on the effect of Trump's tariffs in his first term, which frankly I'm not sure we'll have time to get through this week, but we'll do it either this week or next week. But the bottom line is what countries have tended to do, the EU in particular, is not impose huge blanket tariffs in retaliation. What they've done is targeted highly political sectors of the US economy. So what the EU did last time was it targeted sectors where there were ready substitutes for US goods, and the segments of the US economy it targeted were highly political with a lot of leverage in Washington. So the aim was to avoid hurting the EU economy while putting the maximum leverage on the US to try and remove the tariffs. So what the EU did was it put large tariffs on US bourbon and on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, for instance, both of which would go squealing to Washington, whereas in the case of bourbon, there's lots of, Scottish whiskey or French brandy, etc. And China is doing the same thing. The size of the tariffs it's putting on the US are relatively low, but it's opened a regulatory probe into US tech, and that would hopefully put pressure on Washington. One thing that Trump has achieved is that illegal border crossings from the Mexican border apparently have plunged 90%. So the boost the US economy has received from a large increase in labor, illegal labor, over the past few years will disappear. This is the US 2-year yield around the announcement that the US was going to put tariffs on Mexico, and the 2-year yield rose sharply. So the bond market is saying that if Trump imposes tariffs, that will be inflationary and that will tend to make the Fed keep interest rates higher for longer. And finally, moving on to DeepSeek. So DeepSeek gave US tech, this is the share price of the Mag 7, a big shock, but they have since recovered. Gold has been a beneficiary of all this economic uncertainty. Richard will be happy.
I mean, it's sort of happy, sad, Keith.
Yeah.
It's odd because it's very things are very it's a dangerous, potentially quite a dangerous point. So yeah, as is obvious.
Yeah. And finally, in the news section, on to US foreign policy. What does this all mean? Well, it appears that Trump is dismantling the US's historic relationship with the world. So he's dismantled its foreign aid operations, put tariffs on friendly nations such as Canada, and relinquished its role as the superpower champion of the Western world and global policeman. So Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has stated that the post-war global order is not just obsolete, it's now a weapon being used against us. What do we think his aims are? Well, Donald Trump appears to have decided that US global leadership is no longer worth the cost, hence his dismantling of US aid. And the US appears to be resigning from its role of moral and perhaps military leadership in order to concentrate on its own best interests rather than those of the wider Western alliance. So other Western nations no longer have a privileged position as allies and are merely being treated as other countries to negotiate with, i.e. Canada. Richard, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably where he's going. I think so. You have to say a couple of things. First of all, it has done. The US has done some very good things. It's done some very bad things over the past few decades, and huge instability in the Middle East is one of the very bad things it's done. But actually, a lot of stability around the world has also created a very good thing it's done.
Yes.
So it is not. It has not always been a force. It's solely a force for good. I think that it is militarily, it is obviously the strongest country in the world. China is racing to try and catch up with it, but I think it's probably realistically a long way behind. But I also think recent adventures has shown that the military assets, where operated from thousands of miles away, can actually have limited effect, and that the power is most concentrated near your own borders. From an economic point of view, the US economy has evolved in the circumstances of it being a hegemon and the current world order, and that if it changes the current world order, it changes the economic circumstances in which it subsists, and it then creates a significant problem for itself economically, including its debt levels.
Yes, very good point.
Yeah, and the sustainability of its debt. And I think that actually one of the dangers that they don't appear to be aware of, or if they're aware of, they're not bothering about it, is that the US may fail to raise debt outside of the US and may ultimately effectively crash its own economy via that route. And I think that's why gold and Bitcoin are moving in the way they are moving.
Right. Yeah, good point, Richard. Okay, and after all that, on to the economic data. Now, a quick summary, and all this is subject to huge provisos because the US is disrupting everything. If it imposes tariffs on the EU, which it has promised to do, and the UK, which it has kind of threatened to do, but says that the UK position is much more negotiable, then everything changes and the UK and EU economies will weaken further. But right now, in the UK, private sector is clearly weakening. Numbers out this morning that I haven't been able to find a chart for show that private sector hiring is slowing even further in January. The question is, to what extent will increased public sector spending offset that? You've seen that the Bank of England has halved the growth forecast for the UK to 0.75% for this year. The EU economy is weak and expected to weaken further over the course of the year. The US is just fine, but it's the recent macro data show the bursts of strength post-election fading a bit. China weak. If the but the tariffs will make that weaker, make it weaker. Richard, the UK.
Thank you, Keith. Okay, so there's UK interest rate showing the Bank of England base rate cut. As Keith said earlier, that's just cutting interest rates despite raising its inflation forecast for the coming year. And as Keith also said earlier, we are moving in. Unfortunately, we appear to be moving towards stagflation, and that is a mess. It's hard to see quite how we get out of it. I have some theories and some ideas myself, but unfortunately, I'm not in a position to implement them.
I actually was disappointed the Bank of England cut, particularly unanimously. The thing is, what happened last time during the pandemic was, although a lot of the increased inflation was out of control, what the Bank of England got wrong was they didn't respond to the rise in prices because they thought that it was one-off and it wouldn't lead to longer term inflation. What they failed to react to was the fact that the private sector people demanded wage rises to compensate them for higher inflation. And the danger is the same thing happens this time.
Really agree. I mean, we're not out of the inflationary whirlpool yet, are we, by any means? I think,
No.
And particularly with the advent of Trump 2 and all of the huge amount of uncertainty that's swimming around the global economy. The UK S&P manufacturing PMI basically slightly better than expectations.
Yeah, surprising actually, and very good. But if tariffs come in, that's not going to be positive.
Yeah, and services PMI actually slightly below expectations, but at the moment it's following a little bit of a down. Well, probably almost following a 12-month downtrend.
Yeah, but not a collapse, not negative, not below 50. I mean,
yeah, and the composite is fairly flat at around about 50 and a half, slightly better than expectations. UK construction PMI has fallen dramatically since the autumn.
Yeah, I was surprised by this because the government is promoting house building and also spending money on refurbishment of hospitals, etc. Not good. If you're interested, please pause and read the box which comes from Trading Economics discussing it.
And in London, there's still vast amounts of tower blocks being built everywhere you look.
Yeah.
Blocks going up. The UK Consumer Confidence Index is still steady at -22. We've discussed in the past that it seems to have stabilised at a lower level than pre-COVID. I don't know if you could say it's stabilised, but it certainly is. UK car production was pretty poor in December and is looking pretty sick generally.
So I went skiing with somebody who works for Jaguar Land Rover. And so I had not been aware that they've actually closed down the entire Jaguar production line. They're not selling Jaguar cars at the moment.
Really? Is
Yeah.
that Liverpool?
I'm not sure, but they are rejigging the whole production line to the new generation of vehicles. And reallocated all the Jaguar staff to elsewhere within the organization.
So actually, the old models then they're running off stock, but then so therefore
Yeah.
their production has been cut by whatever it was to zero.
Yeah. So that will be in these numbers. But interesting. And then he was, there was the whole controversy about the woke new Jaguar
Pink,
advert.
whatever, yeah.
Yeah. The multicolored,
Yeah.
multi-sexual one. Well, which got a lot of controversy. Well, they were ecstatic about that because previously only something like 5% of Jaguar buyers were women, and viewers of the advert and the social engagement, about 30% were women. So, you know,
Had the desired effect.
had the desired effect. I thought they were awful, those adverts, but, they're quite happy. We'll see what happens.
We weren't the target market, Keith.
Precisely.
UK consumer credit, just over £1 billion in December, so fairly steady.
Yeah, not bad.
So UK net mortgage lending was significantly higher than expectations. And net lending to individuals was also significantly higher than expectations in December. UK money supply actually really has been flat, pretty much flat for 2 years now. Minor change. Nationwide house price index month on month was 0.1%, worse than expected, but year on year, very slightly below expectations at 4.1%.
Yeah, that's the December number, and this is for January for Halifax.
So January is 2.7%, 3% year on year for January. So house prices still rising at a fairly significant rate.
Yeah, so Halifax are saying that UK house prices hit a new all-time high in January.
Yeah.
Surprising.
Surprising because M1 isn't increasing. UK Citigroup, the economic surprise index is it's bouncing around the bottom of the bad news in which I think is actually probably about right. There isn't much good news, is there?
Agreed.
I also think that house prices rising is bad news.
Yeah, totally.
And indeed, jobs posting, it still looks like it's falling.
It does.
Trend might be softening, but it hasn't broken. So the US says it runs a trade surplus with the UK, which means that it's less likely to impose tariffs on the UK, which of course is good news for us. And we report a big trade surplus with the US, which is bad news for us. So data collection is not currently is not our strong point.
No. So apparently this has been going on for many years.
But we don't tell Donald this. You need to explain this chart.
Well, so nobody's actually entirely sure what's going on. So the US includes the Crown dependencies, that's Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man in its data, while the UK does not. But that does not explain this huge discrepancy. They think they run a trade surplus with us. We think we run a huge trade surplus with them. Both can't be right.
No. And Donald Trump seems to have engendered a shift to the right in British politics, with reform overtaking the Tories as the second most popular party. The Tories really do need to get their act together.
They do.
We do not want Nigel Farage. So UK statistics, this is showing that UK statistics are an outlier in poor survey responses of late, and our survey. I read it somewhere over the weekend that the UK is thinking of making survey responses a legal requirement.
Really?
Yeah.
You can't do that. I mean, that's just idiotic.
Something has to be done to get the quality of the data. I don't know whether it's that, but clearly data quality is very poor. And when you get a response at this level, your ascertainment bias is going to be massive.
Yeah, that's true. So altruism or payments would work. Threatening to throw people in jail is not going to work because it's not a credible threat.
I mean, I have to say, as the recipient of these surveys in the past, they're a complete pain to complete. And they ask for a lot of detailed information that you don't really have.
Oh, right.
That you wouldn't, and you don't actually collect as part of your day-to-day operations because it's not relevant. So you have to go hunting around for this stuff when you're busy, and they actually need to. I think they need to redesign the data they really need to collect, and then maybe they
Yes,
get better response rates.
absolutely.
It's just burdensome. So this is a chart that shows the labour force survey suggesting there hasn't really been a significant pickup in employment since COVID, whereas the resolution foundation estimates say there's been a very significant rise in employment, and the employment fall was not as much as data suggests. So there's clearly a disparity of significant portions between these two sources of employment data, and the UK, I think, is struggling with this very poor quality data.
Yeah. The Bank of England is making its decisions off unreliable data.
Yeah. The bottom line is we've got low growth, stagflation, but not a recession yet, although at 0.75% annual growth, we're not very far off it.
Thank you, Richard. On to the EU. So the ECB cut rates to 2.9%. In her press conference, Christine Lagarde said that inflation would fluctuate around the current level in the near term, but longer term, it would head down towards the 2% target. The reason they're cutting is that growth risks are tilted to the downside, and in particular, friction in global trade could weigh on growth, i.e., if Trump imposes tariffs, that will be particularly bad for the Eurozone. Now, the good news is that professional forecasters expect EU inflation to head back towards the 2% target quite quickly later this year.
Can I just make an observation about professional forecasters, Keith?
Yes. I think we know what it is.
Observation made.
Yes. Now, when you look at the history of Eurozone interest rates, they have really struggled to maintain anything positive. They're rapidly tended to head back towards very low levels. So I would suspect the same is going to happen this time. Now, but the markets do not see the ECB cutting rates to below 2%. So 31st of December, you're looking at the blue line, and over the course of the last month, the pathway for ECB rates has been up. They're not expecting rates below 2%. But the ECB is forecasting a sharp fall in wage growth this year, which should bring inflation down due to poor economic growth. So inflation in January came at minus 0.3%, which was below expectations. Year on year, it came at 2.5%, which was above expectations and heading in the wrong direction. Core remained flat at 2.7%, above expectations. Expectations were for it to fall. And the fundamental problem for the Eurozone, like the UK, is that services inflation remains way too high at 3.9%. Retail sales in December were poor, down 0.2% month on month, below expectations. Year on year came in at 1.9%, in line with expectations. GDP growth in Q4 was a very disappointing 0, below expectations of 0.1% and down on Q3, but not negative. Year on year, 0.9%. So the Eurozone grew 0.9% in 2024. Nothing like the US. The unemployment rate ticked up again to 6.3%, in line with expectations, but still at very low levels compared to history. Although the economy is weak, the labour markets are relatively tight. Consumer confidence actually ticked up slightly to minus 14.2, and actually by historic standards, that's not a terrible number. Economic sentiment actually ticked up in January. Now, the proviso to all this is that these surveys almost certainly took place before Donald Trump started mitigating tariffs everywhere. So let's see what happens to these numbers next month. Industrial sentiment also ticked up to minus 12.9, still a very poor number. Consumer inflation expectations dipped slightly. That's good. But company selling price expectations rose. Now, that is not a terrible number by historic standards, but it is moving in the wrong direction. The manufacturing PMI ticked up, but that is still poor. Services PMI ticked down, and that's a relatively weak number, meaning the composite was just above 50. So in expansion territory, moving up though the last 3 months. Construction PMI improved to 45.4, but still in contraction. Loans to companies actually improved in December. Year on year, 1.5%. Loans to households, 1.1% year on year. Those are not great numbers, but at least they're positive. M3 money supply, 3.5% below expectations, but still decently positive. The economic surprise index actually improved markedly to minus 5.2. Not great, but the Eurozone economy is meeting poor expectations. The German Indeed job postings drifting down again, just like France. Again, still seems to be drifting down. Now, this is European industrial capacity utilization. Not good. A lot of factories working at well below capacity. And when you look at, compared to history, that is at deep recessionary levels. European industry not doing well. And the recent surge in inflation, bounce inflation, which is primarily due to energy prices, means that German interest rates are negative once again. And the Taylor rule is suggesting that the appropriate interest rate for Germany would be 4.9%, as opposed to the ECB's 1.9%. But German GDP forecasts keep on falling. So, like Britain, Germany has stagflation.
Of course, the other issue is that not Germany, but which is not particularly highly indebted, but the Eurozone is very highly indebted, parts of it. And the ECB feels compelled to lower interest rates to try and reduce the debt burden. Of course, ultimately, the markets may decide for it.
Well, the thing is that in France, they're cutting the deficit to 5.4% of GDP. I mean, the trouble is the EU has all these rules on deficits. They don't enforce anything.
Yeah.
Good news for the EU economy is that credit flows appear to be normalizing, and that's very good. But in the latest ECB survey, you'll see that banks have been tightening credit standards for Germany and France in Q4. So, will that improvement in credit flows last? This suggests not. And the US economy has been doing really well, whereas the EU economy and UK economies have not been doing well. And this is patents for advanced digital technologies. In the new economy, UK and Europe are falling behind. And on to Richard's point, this is Italy's fiscal balance. You'll see there's a huge break post-COVID. It has not got its fiscal balance under control. But the good thing about being European and UK citizens is that we get a lot of holiday. So you can get, if you move to the US, you will be much richer, about 40% richer than us, but you also get very few holidays. About 26% of US workers don't take any holiday at all. And majority of them, so 50% of them, take 10 days or less. So in summary, the Eurozone is barely growing even before Donald Trump imposes tariffs as he's threatened to do. If tariffs come in, then that will weaken an already weak European economy. Right now, like the UK, the Eurozone is suffering from stagflation, but the weakening economy is likely to cause the ECB to keep cutting rates. On to the US, Richard.
Thank you, Keith. So US interest rates, 4.5% in Q4. And then US non-farm payrolls looking good, 143 versus 170 in the consensus expectations, but looking steady and stable, really.
Yeah, and they revised up the December number.
Yeah. US government payrolls currently flat, but we know what Donald Trump's aims are in that regard. And this is non-farm payrolls revisions, and the numbers of jobs revised down as of March 2024, 589,000. And the problem with this data is that basically the revisions are starting to diverge significantly from the original data.
Yeah. So just to explain what's going on. So once every year in March, the BEA benchmarks non-farm payrolls, which is, created largely driven by a model, to the census data. And then they revise the whole series to match the census data. So they've now revised the whole series to bring it in line with the census data as of March 2024. And so revised all the numbers down by 589,000.
So this is the Employment Diffusion Index, which suggests that most industries are adding jobs in the US.
Yeah, so it looks like the US economy, the strength in job hiring is broadening once again.
Yeah. And household survey employment is reporting a jump in January due to a 2.9% increase in the estimated population.
Yeah. So once again, statistical revisions. But previously, we've been talking about the big gap between the household survey and the payroll survey. And it seems that the payroll survey was more right than the household survey because the household survey was seriously underestimating the size of the population, in part because of illegal immigration.
Yeah. So the Paychex Small Business Jobs Report shows that hiring in January continued to fall. So there are a bit of contradictory evidence.
Precisely. So, and reminder, Paychex provides the payroll systems for many thousand US small businesses, and you'd think they know, and they are not reporting an increase in hiring. In fact, the opposite.
US average weekly earnings went up 0.5% for January, as goes to a consensus expectation of 0.3%. But of course, that is quite a significant rate. If you annualize that, that's a significant rate.
Yeah, no, that's not good. But how much of that is due to, January, New Year pay rises?
And year-on-year average weekly earnings in the US 4.1%, again higher than expectations. So have we got a bit more inflationary pressure in the US economy coming through with higher wage rates?
Yeah, you'd think we would.
Goldman Sachs is estimating that US wage growth is actually continuing to fall, and US average weekly hours worked appears to be continuing to fall from the post-COVID peak, and is sort of now below actually the pre-COVID means.
Yeah, and this is odd. This is contradictory data because either the labour market's tight and you're paying up for wages, hence the rise in earnings, or it's weak and you're not making your workers work as hard as many hours. And that's what this is showing.
Yeah.
So, contradictory.
The US participation rate seems to be pretty steady these last few months at around about 62.5. And the unemployment rate 4% in January, 4.1% in December, so around about 4%.
Yeah, but actually coming down again.
Yeah, slight drop. And the U6 unemployment rate is 7.5%.
Yeah. Now, all this, of course, we're expecting to now start rising as Donald Trump starts firing US workers.
Yeah.
And one of the first things that they've done is cancel a lot of contracts with external parties to the US government. And that will have an effect on employment in the contractors.
US GDP growth quarter on quarter for quarter four was 2.3%, which is a bit lower than expectations at 2.6, but still a decent rate of growth.
Yeah.
Europe would die for it. US PCE prices 2.3% in quarter four, which is quite a lot higher than expectations, doubled expectations.
But still not a bad number.
And core PCE prices quarter on quarter annualized 2.5%. US real consumer spending quarter on quarter annualized up 4.2% in quarter four.
Yeah, amazing.
And the US employment cost index quarter on quarter 0.9% in quarter four.
Yeah, high actually.
Yeah, US productivity growth a meager 1.2% in quarter four.
Yeah.
Below expectations, but still much more positive than we're achieving in the UK.
Yes, and the problem for the UK is that we talked about the poor quality of UK statistics, where and how the independent measurers of the strength of the UK labour market have it stronger than the official numbers do. Well, if those independent statisticians are correct, then already poor UK productivity will be even worse because the number of people in the labour force is larger than the official statistics suggest.
Yeah. Quarter on quarter, labour costs 3% in quarter four, better than expectations of 3.4%. PCE inflation month on month in December was 0.3%, which was on the high side.
Mm-hmm.
PCE inflation year on year 2.6%, which is very slightly above the 2% target.
Yeah, heading in the wrong direction though. Not
Yeah.
looking nice.
Yeah. A month on month PCE inflation 0.2% in December. PCE inflation, core PCE inflation year on year 2.8% in December.
Not coming down and too high.
Yeah. And super core PCE inflation 3.5% in December, as Keith says, still too high. Multivariate core trend inflation, which is the Fed's preferred inflation measure because it gives the lowest number.
Yes.
So there you go, it's 2.3%.
Yeah, coming down.
Creating a multivariate inflation number that's nearly 2%.
Yeah. To be fair to it though, it is more responsive to inflationary pressures on the upside than the traditional measures.
Yeah, true. I'm just an old cynic.
Yeah.
So excluding non-market inputs, the core PCE inflation of 3-month annualized is 1.9%. And by this reading, there is little sign of a resurgence in inflation. But basically, inflation is above the 2%
It is.
target, and the Fed is reducing interest rates. So the US job opening basically continuing a downtrend as it started after 2022.
Yep. And frankly, that's going to get much worse because, Trump is going to cut all the job openings for the government.
Yeah. And government job openings were 880,000. But of course, they are going to fall significantly, probably not too far above zero, given the rate that they're going, because there'll be quite a lot of redeployment going on, one presumes.
Yeah.
Is the US construction cycle finally starting to turn? So job openings in US construction have sort of been falling off a cliff actually.
They have. Yeah.
Since the beginning of 2024, although we didn't realize it to start with.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, Richard, what's puzzling is if you look at non-farm payrolls, the construction sector is still adding jobs.
Yeah.
Then you look at job openings and they're falling off a cliff. So,
So that suggests, doesn't it, that maybe new projects aren't being started at the same rate.
yeah.
Something like that. So the medium-term trend in hiring is down, and in quits is down, and layoffs are stable. So this is showing that hiring is slowly falling over the last 3 to 4 years, as is the quit rate. But
Yeah.
that layoff rate is basically stable.
Well, everyone's hoping there'll now be a cyclical upturn, but actually there's no sign of it yet.
No, not yet. And the consumer jobs balance had a little bit of a tick up in Q4, but it looks like it might be resuming its downtrend now.
Yeah, and again, this is going to be bad because, if you are out of work and the government is laying loads of people off, then, it's going to be even harder to find a job.
Yeah. US ADP employment change was 183,000 in January, a bit better than expected. Fairly stable. US calendar job cuts, not showing anything other than a sort of a continuing steady, stable, low level.
Yeah, no sign of an increase.
Yeah. The S&P Global Manufacturing PMI of 49.7, but the trend since September has been upwards.
Yeah, that's back in expansion territory.
And the services PMI significantly down in January, still expansionary.
But yeah, a big drop actually. Now, you do wonder whether Donald Trump cutting the contracts of the US government, that is going to have an effect on the services industry.
It is. And I think also cutting US aid it's going to have that's part of the same thing, isn't it? That will also be a contributor to it. So global composite PMI was at 52.4, which is below expectations. And that is not, it's not looking unhealthy, but neither is it suggesting that the US economy is roaring away.
Yeah, health warning though. Historically, there's been a very weak correlation between the PMIs and actual economic activity. It's more about how these companies are feeling than they're actually acting.
Yeah. And both services and manufacturing sectors are reporting rising prices.
Yeah,
Although
not
not yet out of that range they've been in for the last 15 or 16 months.
Yeah.
Moving towards the top of it. The ISM manufacturing PMIs at 50.9 in January, which is looking quite healthy.
Yep.
And services PMI a bit below expectations, but within the range it's been in the last 2 years.
Yep.
Durable goods orders fell in December and fell in November. So durable goods orders graph is actually looking not particularly strong. Construction spending looks okay.
Looks solid. Yep.
And Chicago Fed National Activity Index. And the trouble with this is the scale has been so distorted by COVID, it's hard to see graphically what's happening.
But I mean, the point is, it's plus 0.15. So it's saying in December, the US economy was slightly above average.
Yeah.
So no problem at all.
Yeah. The Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, a little bit below expectations, but that's been rising strongly since mid-2022. Consumer expectations basically showing the same thing, slightly below expectations, but still a rising trend. Consumer current conditions, quite a lot below expectations. Doesn't look fab. Consumer.
Yeah, so Richard, I think the point is that the euphoria after Donald Trump was elected seems to be fading slightly in all these charts.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Keith. Yeah, US consumer 1 year inflation expectations rising quite sharply, actually, 3.3%. And the consumer 5-year inflation expectations round about the same level, in fact, 3.2%.
Yeah, so this is worrying, and that the US consumers may have been listening to all the rhetoric about how tariffs raise inflation, and their inflation expectations are rising. Will they demand higher wages in compensation? Question mark.
The economic optimism index is looking confident.
Yep.
The logistics managers index is looking good and is continuing its rise from 2023.
Yes, and that means more goods are circulating around the US.
Yeah. The Case-Shiller house prices index month on month fell slightly in November. Year on year, it's 4.3%, which actually is the same as the UK.
Yeah, very true.
US pending home sales, 4.2 million. So it looks okay. Building permits in that range it's been in for a couple of years.
Yep, and absolutely fine.
Yeah. New home sales in the range it's been in the last couple of years. US balance of trade.
Yeah.
Not good.
Not good. And, when Donald Trump, so you'd say that big spike in December was probably importers trying to get ahead of the tariffs. But you can see Donald Trump's point about it running a big trade deficit. The trouble is that it needs to run a big trade deficit to allow dollars to circulate around the world as part of the global trading system, which relies on US dollars. If he cuts the deficit, that means that fewer dollars circulate around the world and the price of borrowing dollars around the world shoots up. And there's lots of emerging markets have big debts in US dollars. That's bad.
So it's a case of wanting to have your cake and eat it. You want to be the world's reserve currency, but you don't want to issue dollars. You want to be the world's reserve currency, so you have power and you can sanction other countries that don't do what you like. And at the same time, you don't like the fact that you have a balance of trade deficit. Ultimately, not in the short term, but in the long term, you can't have it both ways.
Precisely. Well put, Richard.
US initial jobless claims. That looks like the economy is just ticking along nicely, doesn't it? Continuing at the standard, at the normal rate, really. Continuing jobless claims. It's doing the same thing. It picked up in September. It stayed at that higher level since then, but it isn't going anywhere abnormal.
Yeah. Now it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to this in the next few months.
It is. Jobs posting index, I would say that chart is still on a downtrend, but it is flat off.
Yep. No big rise since Trump came in.
Which is what you would expect given what he's been doing so far. Link up continues to report rapidly declining jobs opening in the US. It is actually, isn't it? It's really
yeah.
And the scale. I was going to say the scale on the left-hand side is quite good. It's dropped from 2.9 million to 2.6 million. So it's got a long way to go before it gets down to zero.
Yeah.
But it's still quite a big, sharp drop. And falling job openings means people losing their jobs, taking longer to find new ones. And that is indeed what this is showing. So we have some consistent data here, Keith.
Yes, we do. And that is not a good number by historic standards.
No. The Dallas Fed weekly economic GDP estimate is 2.5%. The Atlanta Fed GDP now is 2.9%. The New York Fed GDP nowcast is 3%.
And rising.
Yes.
And this is the one we like the most, actually.
Yeah. And the St. Louis nowcast 2.38%.
So everyone's saying the US economy is doing just fine.
And the economic surprise index is doing what it's doing.
Yeah.
US trueflation 2.16%. Having dropped very dramatically late January. US Federal Reserve balance sheet 6.8 trillion, continuing to fall from its peak of 8.2 trillion.
But it seems that QT still has a very, very long way to go.
Yeah. Also, they have released the Treasury General Reserve account, haven't they, which had 2 trillion in it. And so, if you add that back, which I think legitimately you can do, it means that the number goes back up to 8 trillion. And this is the US debt clock. Now they've had to redesign the screen on the US debt clock so they could fit the numbers in. That was a joke,
Yeah.
by the way.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Richard. But the point is they've added this Doge clock,
Oh yeah.
and the Doge clock, they're suggesting that that Elon Musk is saving the US government $1 billion a day. Now we've got a big section on that coming up, but uh, spoiler alert, I can't see anything he suggested that gets us anywhere near $1 billion a day. I'll take you through it.
I agree with that, Keith. It seems an extraordinary number so far,
Yeah,
given what they. I mean, unless they say, well, we've stopped making all these payments. They're actually not. If you just stop making the payments, they're not savings.
yeah, absolutely.
You haven't worked out what the liability is.
Yeah.
So the US has a record 10 trillion in debt to refinance and currently it's a lot, isn't it? And most of it they refinance with short-term debt, don't they? Because
Yeah.
that's what the market wants to buy, and that's expensive.
Yeah. So interest rates have shot up. They're going to have to refinance a hell of a lot of debt at higher rates. That will exacerbate the deficit.
So there's our summary with a bottom line that the US economy is doing just fine, as far as we can see, but the Trump administration is going to be cutting a lot of government expenditure and jobs. There's going to be a lot of argy-bargy about it, but ultimately that will happen, and that will have an effect on the economic growth in the coming months. And the uncertainty around economic policy is rising, not just in the US, but all over the world.
And if you think about, his tariffs on Mexico, I mean, 25%. Now, 25%, if you're a US car maker and you're getting your components from Mexico, you'd be thinking, well, should I move production to Arizona or somewhere in the US? And that's going to mean building a new factory, very expensive. Now, are you going to do that if you don't know how long tariffs are going to last or if they're going to come in? No, you're not. And so actually that uncertainty delays investment and means that actually companies are more likely to simply accept the tariffs, which will be inflationary.
I agree, Keith. I think it doesn't help businesses plan what they need to do, does it? It's a very confrontational approach.
Yeah. Bad for economic growth,
Yeah.
bad for inflation. On to China. Now, last time I asked you about what I should do about the China section, and the consensus seemed to be that continue but cut down the data. So I'm doing that. So this is the National Bureau of Statistics General PMI, and that weakened quite sharply in January, expected to weaken further as the trade war worsens. The Caixin weakened slightly but remained stronger than the official numbers. Inflation actually ticked up really sharply at the start of the new year. Reminder, inflation had been negative and very low, but it's now ticked up to 0.5% in December, and month on month it was 0.7%, so big increases in prices. Industrial profits continue to drift off, down 3.3% year on year, although that was better than expectations. Now, these are growth forecasts and they are fading. Independent forecasters are not expecting China to meet its 5% target. They're expecting actually growth to drift steadily lower. This is a nasty chart. China has a debt to GDP ratio of 370% and rising, and that figure excludes the shadow banks. As growth slows, how is that going to be serviced? Financial repression, more of it, looks like the likely solution. You can do that in China. You can't do it in the West. Good news is that the percentage of Chinese energy production that comes from fossil fuels is falling, and the percentage of renewables is rising actually quite quickly. But fossil fuels remain 87% of the energy mix. China's summary, well, China's economy is weak and appears to be on a threshold of a trade war with the US, which will only weaken it further. Let's see what happens. On to one chart. Now, if you look at, so in order for the US fiscal balance to be sustainable, i.e., the debt to not keep on rising, then the yield on the 10-year, so the yield on the yield curve, the average yield that the US pays on its debt, must equal nominal growth. And if we assume that 10-year equals nominal growth, then in order to make the debt sustainable, the US would need to cut the fiscal deficit by an enormous 3.6%. Now, reminder, in 2025, the fiscal deficit is forecast to be 6.5% of GDP during a period when the US economy is growing nicely. DOGE is aiming to cut the fiscal deficit, but 3.6 is a huge tightening. And if they did achieve that, then you would slow the US economy markedly. So the US economy has been benefiting from enormous fiscal largesse, and they're stuck. If they do get the fiscal deficit under control, they will slow the economy. Watch this space. That is what they're intending to do. So everything we've talked about this week is subject to the proviso. We don't know what Donald Trump's actually going to achieve. And when we talked about what he'd done in the past couple of weeks, you'll notice a lot of them were subject to judicial review. So he's talking about doing lots of stuff, but when you actually look at his lists of achievements, it is much lower. Okay, and on to DeepSeek. Now, we're only going to do 2 segments this week because we've already used up a lot of your time. So we're going to do DeepSeek and then we're going to do DOGE. So DeepSeek, what is it? What's happened? So on the 20th of January, DeepSeek released its R1 model and rapidly caused a sharp sell-off in US tech stocks. Why? So DeepSeek R1 is a Chinese AI model that had comparable performance with ChatGPT, but was developed at a fraction of the cost. So it developed its V3 model, which was a bigger model than R1, requiring just 2048 of NVIDIA's H800 chips. Now, those chips are the old model. They're not the latest NVIDIA version, and those were not subject to the US export controls. And it claims to have trained the V3 model at a cost of $5.6 million. And that contrasts with OpenAI's ChatGPT-4, which cost $100 million to train. So at almost 95% lower cost to develop V3. And what it seems to have happened is that limited access to hardware has forced DeepSeek to be extraordinarily creative. So DeepSeek had access to around $500 million worth of GPUs. And so the real cost of developing V3 and R1 was almost certainly more than the 5.6 million. 5.6 million just refers to the training cost, not the hardware cost. But it still was done at a fraction of the cost of OpenAI's models. So the other thing DeepSeek did was they issued a detailed technical report of what they'd done, as well as much of the code for R1, which is open, which they've made open source and allowed developers to use. And developers have already started making their own models using the R1 code. So previously, the CEOs of top US companies in particular, such as OpenAI and Anthropic, had been promoting the idea of a scaling law by which the biggest AI models would have the most power and use the most data. They would be the smartest. They would be the ones that were used the most. The analogy would be with Google search engines. So you would have a few tech monopolies that dominated AI, and that has been entirely upended by DeepSeek AI. So suddenly, DeepSeek AI is showing that you can build comparable models to ChatGPT for a fraction of the cost and make them open source so that everyone can develop their own. So very quickly, the notion that AI would be dominated by a few tech monopolies has been completely upended. And the other thing was they didn't rely on NVIDIA's CUDA software. And so therefore, another one of NVIDIA's moats has proved to be ineffective. So what is DeepSeek R1? So DeepSeek V2, so one of the earlier models from which R1 is evolved, was released in May 2024, and it had two important breakthroughs. And those breakthroughs were called mixture of experts and multilateral attention. So mixture of experts. So ChatGPT, when you activate the large language model, you use all of it. So that's the entire model so the entire model is used during both training and inference. But for any particular task, only a small part of that model is used. And therefore, what DeepSeek have done is they've broken the model up into separate sub-expert procedures, and they only activate the relevant ones when they're needed for a particular task. And that means the model can be much more efficient. That saves saving and computer power. And it means that you can keep on adding expert units, and that makes the whole system more flexible. Now, the other innovation was multi-latent attention. Now, frankly, I don't entirely understand this. There are various explainers on the internet. If you want a full explanation, go to them. But basically, it involves the use of memory on the chip. So the big NVIDIA chips, they've got a cache memory on them, and that is a limitation to the performance of the chip. So when you're running one of these large language models, you need to load up both the model and the entire data set it runs on. And you then, as it processes, need to transfer memory around the chip. So what multi-head latent attention does is reduce memory usage. And that means it reduces this latency as the processor demands data from the memory. And so that speeds up the processing of the model and makes it more efficient. So that was V2. V3 in December 2024 added further innovations and made it much cheaper to run versus ChatGPT. So DeepSeek claimed the model took 2,788,000 hours on H800 chip, and that's where you get the $5.6 million development cost number out of at a cost of $2 per GPU hour. In contrast, ChatGPT 4 took $100 million to claim. Now, when if you've been reading about DeepSeek, you'll know that they've been accused of distilling the other bigger, more well-known large language models in order to arrive at their own models. So what is distillation? Well, distillation is the process of transferring knowledge from a large, expensive large language model to a small one. So we're going to refer to the big large language model you're copying as the teacher and the small one, i.e. DeepSeek, as the student. And the aim is to get all the functionality of the teacher at a fraction of the learning cost. So the advantage of a distillation model are it's much cheaper, and it's cheaper to both develop and to run. So the R1 model is 30 times cheaper to run than OpenAI's model. And because it's a distilled model, it's less complex, it's faster, and it can be run, therefore, on platforms with limited computational resources, i.e. mobile phones. The disadvantage is a potential loss of accuracy. So how does this work? So this is a picture of a cat, and when you feed it into a large language model, it will come out with the output comparing it to all other images and texts and tags within its data set. And it will say this large language model believes that this is 80% cat, 6% leopard, etc., etc. That is the output of the large language model with the summary that they think it's a cat. So in distillation, you start with that image and those labels. And so what the student model is doing is it's taking the output of the teacher model and associating the image with the labels. It is not associating the image with all the other images of cats and tags in the whole data set. And that really simplifies the process of building the model. And what you're then attempting to do is minimize the distillation loss, i.e. the difference between your model's output and the output of the teacher model. Was that clear, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I think correctly, another way of pushing it then would be that the student model actually relies on the analysis of the teacher model of the image and takes that analysis as correct and doesn't do the prior work. So the student model couldn't actually exist without access to the teacher model.
Yes, very good point. So what is R1? So R1 is a further development of the V3 model, but with enhanced logical reasoning capabilities. And this is really interesting and important. So previously, large language models have relied on reinforcement learning with human feedback, i.e. the model comes out with an answer and a human has to say whether that answer is correct or not as part of the training process. Now, where large language models have made really fast progress is where they can play against themselves. So you think of chess or AlphaGo, they simply play games against themselves. At the end, you know who's won. Now, one of the problems with developing large language models for general use is at the end, they come up with an answer and they're not sure whether that's right or wrong, and you need a human to tell them whether it's right or wrong. So what DeepSeek have done is they've got rid of that. They've managed to find a way in which the large language model can check itself, can mark itself at the end of the process. And that means it can develop much faster without human input. So DeepSeek gave the model a set of maths, code, and logic questions, and 2 reward functions, one for the right answer and one for showing its workings. And then it encouraged the model to try different approaches to getting the answer and graded them according to how well they were doing. And that means we've reached this really important moment where AI models are teaching other AI models. So R1 is distilled from ChatGPT, we believe. Don't sue me. That's what everyone is saying. And AI models are then teaching themselves without human input. So AI models can now grow exponentially in their effectiveness. Thoughts, Richard?
Yeah, so I mean, it's basically what it's done is it's taking well, it's doing two things, isn't it? It's relying upon the original work of OpenAI and ChatGPT and so forth. It's relying on that original work, and it's taking a distillation of that work and using clever programming, making the subsidiary model much better than the prime model. My question is, I worry about AIs teaching themselves, because at what point do they become exponentially wrong? And then the ultimate question is, to what extent, as these models become much more efficient, to what extent does the potential disruption of our societies increase?
Yeah.
And I think it raises, if it is as good and does sort of basically ultimately enhance the efficiency of, so let's say, OpenAI, if they adopt this, if it enhances the efficiency of that type of model dramatically, that then presumably enhances the ability to apply it to the real world, and that makes the rate of change in the real world much faster.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. Now, I would hope to see a big improvement in, for example, coders' productivity.
Yeah.
If DeepSeek R1 can prove itself to be an extremely efficient coder, then coders become basically monitors rather than writers. And so you'd hope to see a big improvement in their productivity and fall in their cost, which would be great for some of our startups, Richard. But so far, I see very little evidence of either an increase in productivity or a fall in cost, which is one of my frustrations.
Very interesting explanation, though, Keith. Thank you for doing that.
Well, it's really interesting. It seems to me that AI could really have an impact on the world economy very quickly. And as we've talked about this previously, things such as paralegals, they could be toast. And that would be very good for productivity, very bad for the labor force. So this is the relative performance of DeepSeek R1 versus OpenAI, and there is very little difference. Take a look. And they have released a lot of the code for R1. Making it open source means that other developers can use it and play around with it, develop their own models. And there is an AI development platform called Hugging Face, where they're saying within a few days, at least 500 models had already been developed using DeepSeek AI. So the AI revolution will be accelerating from here because it's open source. Anyone can play with it.
Yeah.
Now, previously, the narrative had been that AI would be a monopoly of the US tech giants. Now, and in analogy to Facebook, Google search, etc. Now, the reason that they had monopolies is that they leveraged two economic forces. Number one, network effects. So, if you think of Facebook, it's valuable because everyone's on it. The more people you had on one of these social networks, the more valuable it became. And why be on any other if Facebook is larger and it contains all your friends? So, network effects enabled monopolies. Two, economies of scale. When you've got Facebook, the cost of adding a new user is close to zero, and the advertising is largely done by itself because there's a strong network effects. If all your friends are on it, then you tend to join just to be with them. Facebook doesn't need to advertise to get you on there. So the marginal cost of the extra user was very low, or in fact negative. The point is that neither of those effects will tend to enforce a monopoly in AI. So there are no network effects. It doesn't matter to you whether your friend uses OpenAI or DeepSeek R3. And economies of scale, well, again, there aren't any because now it's been shown that DeepSeek R3 can work just as effectively at a fraction of the cost. You know, it doesn't need to build the biggest, most powerful AI model in the world to match ChatGPT. And therefore, all the big tech companies throwing billions of dollars have not developed a better model. None of that suggests that AI will be dominated by Silicon Valley.
But if I could just, what I would do, and I am no expert, what I would do if I were OpenAI, for example, was I would simply limit DeepSeek's access to my LLM and say it can't use it without paying me. And so it creates a different revenue stream, and it basically shuts the door on access to its model over a particular level unless it's paid.
Well, I think that's very difficult to do, Richard, because A, they've developed the model, and B, they just use some other entity to access the model. If they can.
I don't think you could do that. I think two things, Keith. I think one, DeepSeek will only ever be better or as good as it'll only ever be as good as presumably the LLM it accesses. So
Yeah.
if OpenAI then introduce another LLM that's better than the current one, DeepSeek will fall behind unless it can access the new one. And OpenAI, because it has to extract so much data from it, vast amounts of data, OpenAI will be very well aware of what's going on and can simply throttle it.
Well, I'm more optimistic than you are, Richard. I think the Chinese will develop their own equivalent to ChatGPT, and OpenAI will just DeepSeek will simply distill that. And I think that there's no way you can stop this. There are so many different LLMs all around the world. And
you may be right, Keith, and it may be that there's some sort of settle somewhere in the middle. And the other thing I would say here is that the US government, rightly in my mind, has banned DeepSeek being used on any US digital device because of fear of spying.
No, absolutely. But the big implication is, the use of any technology depends on cost. And DeepSeek have just massively lowered the cost. And so you'd expect the use of AI to accelerate from here. So investment implications. The Mag 7 will not monopolize AI, and that is bad, particularly bad for OpenAI and other companies wishing to sell large language models.
So I have to chip in here, Keith, to say I'm not sure that it's, from what I've just said, I'm not sure that it's as black and white as that, because I think that they will find a way to monetize these derivative models that want to use their LLM.
Yes, no, absolutely they will. But frankly, you're not going to have to pay for them. You can use, the cheap open source, DeepSeek version for a fraction of the cost. So I don't think that it's undoubtedly erodes their competitive position in the marketplace.
I agree that it probably will erode it. Yeah.
Now, is it good or bad for Nvidia? It's not sure. Nvidia's share price dipped sharply and then recovered because, as we've just said, this will accelerate the AI revolution, and that will create increased demand for chips. Now, everyone's been talking about Jevons law. So Jevons law is that when you reduce the cost of something, you increase demand. So his observation was about the efficiency of steam engines during the Industrial Revolution. As you made steam engines more efficient, they reduced the amount of their coal consumption. So you'd think that that would mean coal consumption would fall because steam engines use less of it. But actually, it made steam engines more efficient, cheaper to use. And so demand for steam engines shot up. Therefore, coal use remained stable or went up rather than fell. The analogy here is with the cost of AI. Because it's cheaper, more people will use it. Therefore, demand for chips will go up.
Just a quick apology, as I've discussed with Keith. I have to go because I've got something else I need to do now. But I think what DeepSeek has done, as Keith has rightly pointed out, is basically upended our understanding of what the economics of AI will be, and it's upended our understanding of how it's going to develop, i.e., not necessarily via monopolistic channels, which actually is good for the rest of the world and bad for the US. So I think it's fascinating, and I think we need to keep a very close eye on how this is going to evolve, because it's going to be very important over the next few years in terms of society, not just technology. So I think it's really interesting. Thank you, Keith. I'm sorry I have to go now, but
Okay.
I'm sure we will be picking this up in due course.
Well, I'm sure we will. Okay. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Keith.
Yeah.
Yeah, see you tomorrow.
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
Cheers.
Cheers. So bad, DeepSeek R1 shows that it's not necessary to have vast numbers of the latest AI chips. It was built with the previous version, the H800 chip, which was not subject to US sanctions. As Discord member Joe A points out, the cheaper models are more useful. And so why pay up for the latest, more expensive NVIDIA chips if you can run them on the old ones? And cheaper is better. So the AI revolution will almost certainly widen and accelerate from here. That means bad news for low and mid-skill service jobs such as paralegals. It is good news for labour productivity for those who retain their jobs, and therefore good news for inflation. DeepSeek is not necessarily the winner, though, because it's given away a lot of code, and it's shown that good AI models can be built quite cheaply. Expect a lot of imitators. Now, the Mag 7 have been spending enormously on CapEx, and that's going to be increasingly difficult to justify if they can't earn a decent return on it at the end. Fear that there would be a drop in investment in NVIDIA chips led to a sharp fall in its share price and the biggest drop in market capitalization suffered by any company in history. Now, this is Google's capital expenditure, and you'll see it's massively increased in the last couple of years. Will they now start to cut back? But the NVIDIA share price, it hasn't regained its previous highs, but it's not fallen off a cliff. Power companies, utilities were some of the biggest fallers. So DeepSeek R1 has shown that you can run these models much more efficiently. Previously, the market had been expecting big tech to build loads of huge data centers. That is now called into question. And shares in all chip makers also fell sharply. If you can run R1 on old chips, why do you need the new ones? And DeepSeek is not alone. China has lots of different AI developers. I expect all of them to make similar progress. And so I don't think ChatGPT will have a monopoly of any kind. And so this graphic shows the effect of AI on the labor market. What you're going to have is substitution of software for labor. And that is bad for employment, good for software companies, and is profoundly deflationary or disinflationary. And on to the Department of Government Efficiency. So Elon Musk is intent on cutting the size of the US government. And he would like to get the size of the US government back to where it was pre-pandemic, which means cutting 1 or 2 trillion off the size of it. And he's claiming that he is saving the US government about 1 billion a day. And saw earlier the debt clock appears to be following his pronouncements. Is that credible? Well, first of all, what is DOGE? So it's the Department of Government Efficiency and is created by Donald Trump by executive order on his first day in office. But it doesn't have a formal role in the government. Its full name is the US DOGE Service Temporary Organization. This is a temporary organization under the United States DOGE Service, which is the renamed US Digital Service, which was created under President Obama. So it is headed by Elon Musk and aims to slash excess regulation and cut wasteful expenditure, etc. Its previous co-head was Vivek Ramaswamy, but he has now stepped down. Elon Musk is in sole charge. It is not a government agency. Its formal power is limited. It advises Donald Trump and the departments, and only they can execute its recommendations. Donald Trump can execute it by executive order. And executive orders, which Donald Trump has been making a lot of use of, do not require congressional approval, but they are subject to legal review, and Congress can pass a law that overrides an executive order, but the president would then have a veto over that law. Bottom line, DOGE has no executive powers. It cannot cancel or alter contracts or regulations. The relevant departments, though, can do it, acting on its advice. And what is Elon Musk's legal status? Well, he has been designated a special government employee, and that is anyone who works or is expected to work for the government for 130 days or less in a 365-day period. And it was created back in 1962 in order to get more professional expertise from the private sector into government. And Musk has been classified as a volunteer, not a full-time employee, and therefore is exempt from rules on financial disclosure and conflicts of interest. The latter is important because Musk owns SpaceX and Twitter and various other companies, all of which could benefit or do benefit from government contracts, and therefore he is subject to potential conflicts of interest. He is also not subject to congressional oversight. He reports to Donald Trump. Quote, Elon can't do and won't do anything without our approval. We'll give him the approval where appropriate. Where not appropriate, we won't. But he reports in. That's Donald Trump. So what is DOGE doing? Well, DOGE has been very busy. Following its advice, the government has begun to dissolve US aid amongst a barrage of rhetoric about the corruption of US aid. And USAID is the US's main humanitarian and development agency. It will no longer be an independent agency at the end of this process, but will be subsumed within the State Department. As we discussed earlier, 2,200 employees have been put on leave, although a judge has now blocked that, and its budget is likely to be cut. DOGE employees have, quote, been given read-only access to the Treasury Department payment system, and that involves payments to just about everything, all the contracts that the US government has to make payments for, and that would potentially allow DOGE employees to scrutinize Social Security and Medicare payments. They've also begun cancelling contracts that DOGE deems wasteful. Reminder, DOGE does not have the power to cancel contracts itself. So let's see what DOGE has actually been doing from its Twitter feed. So 5th of February, cancelled 12 consulting contracts in General Services and Administration, the Department of Education, for a total saving of 30 million. Actually, that's the lifetime of the contract, including a 23 million work order for digital modernization. See, that sounds quite a sensible program to me. And it also cancelled 12 underutilized lease obligations for an annual saving of 3 million. You see, all this is small beer. 4th of February, 36 contracts were terminated for a total of saving of 165 million across 6 agencies. 3rd of February, 20 consulting contracts cancelled for an immediate saving of 26 million. In the past 6 days, 22 leases terminated, total savings 45 million. See, we're getting nowhere near $1 billion a day. These are all small beer. 31st of January, updated data, look at the table on diversity, equality and inclusion contracts cancelled. So in total, they're claiming 1 billion saved from the cancellation of these contracts. Now, that's 1 billion in total is very different from $1 billion a day. 29th of January, they're making the claim the federal government is saving $1 billion a day, mostly from stopping the hire of people into unnecessary positions, deletion of DEI, and stopping improper payments to foreign organizations. But they provide no detail on that. What they have done is stop the hiring of diversity officers and DEI throughout the US government. So in summary, from the Twitter feed, you can see they're cancelling lots of small contracts, and they're claiming they're saving $1 billion a day. But what they're announcing adds up to actually very little, a tiny fraction of that. So other initiatives to downsize the size of the federal government. Well, the White House has offered 2 million federal employees 8 months redundancy pay to resign with immediate effect, and have told all federal employees that they can't guarantee their jobs in future. The offer was not open to members of the military, immigration, or the US Postal Service. Now, we know now that by the deadline, which has since been extended by court order to today, the 6th of February, that around 60,000 federal employees had taken up that offer. But we also know that there's a cap of $25,000 maximum on US federal redundancy payments, which the 8 months offer would breach, and therefore this whole offer is of questionable legality. Let's see what happens. Once again, there's a lot of noise coming out of the White House, but it's not clear there's been so far much effect. A lot of these initiatives have been blocked by the courts so far. The president has ordered a freeze on payments of all federal loans and grants, potentially hitting scientific and medical research. The very controversial, a judge issued a temporary block on the order, and that is not in effect. It's also ordered the Office of Personnel Management to slash its staff by 70% and suspended all green energy disbursements under the IRA Act. So under the Biden's green energy schemes. Now, he's also attempting to shut down US aid. So US aid employs 10,000 people around the world and provides humanitarian assistance with a budget in 2023, 68 billion. So in the grand scheme of things, where the US is running a deficit of 1.1 trillion, US aid is small beer. Now, Trump has claimed he will shut down USAID, and Elon Musk has said that USAID is beyond repair and a ball of worms. The website's been shut down, all its employees were ordered to stay at home, but a judge has now ruled that 2,200 of its staff can't be forcibly put on leave. An act of Congress is needed to dissolve USAID, and that is unlikely to happen. What appears likely to happen is that USAID is being merged with the State Department, who will take over some of its functions, and foreign assistance will now be more aligned with US foreign policy. Donald Trump is aiming to cut the total number of employees from 10,000 to 661. So effectively, whatever the legalities, USAID has effectively been shut down. And he is portraying the fight against USAID as part of the fight against wokeness. And here are some of the things that he claims the USAID were providing money for. Given the way he manipulates language, all of this is open to question in my books. Bottom line, DOGE claims to be saving the US government $1 billion a day, but I've taken you through what he's been showing on his Twitter feed, and I can see no evidence that he's getting anywhere near $1 billion a day. The contract cancellations he's announced on the Twitter feed seems small beer to me. Lease cancellations worth, total of 44 million. I mean, there's nothing. We're talking about $1 billion a day, and that 44 million is the total lifetime of those cancellations. So there's a lot of rhetoric. It's not clear how much he's actually achieving. But what is absolutely clear is the Trump administration is serious about shrinking the size of the US government and shrinking the size of the deficit. We'll just have to wait and see in the debt numbers themselves how much they manage to achieve. So, implications. It looks like many federal employees will lose their jobs. We've had 60,000 accept the offer of redundancy, and the DOGE has already cancelled lots of external contracts, which will hit the employment in service industries of companies that sell their services to the US government. The remaining federal employees will feel increasingly job insecure as DOGE goes round trying to cut their numbers wherever possible. Government funding government spending should fall, which should bring down the fiscal deficit, unless they cut taxes and essentially spend their savings. So all of this would appear to be bad for the US economy unless there is an offsetting increase in growth due to a rise in deregulation or a fall in regulation and or tax cuts. A lot of uncertainty, particularly for federal employees. Okay, I had prepared lots of other segments, but we're already overrunning. So actually, I'm going to skip the lot and I'm going to skip recession watch, inflation watch, etc. this week. Moving on to other charts. One sector in the US that really needs reform and is deeply unpopular is US healthcare. So this chart shows on the y-axis life expectancy, on the x-axis health expenditure per capita. The US has a life expectancy on a par with Poland, but it spends 3 times as much per head of population on health as the Poles do. It has a worse health outcome than the UK, while spending roughly double per head. Deeply unpopular, but big business. And Trump likes big business. They fill his coffers. So let's see if he does anything about it. This is the time spent in recession in various decades. And you'll see under the gold standard, recessions were common. In more recent decades, very uncommon. Don't bet on a recession, note to self. Because these days they're increasingly rare. In the US, over 50% of stock trading is now done off exchange in dark exchanges between big US Wall Street banks. That is potentially poor for price discovery. Pause, take a look. This is countries ranked by the percentage of their population are aged over 65. So Monaco heads the world. It's 36% of its population is over 65. But Japan is 30%. Italy is actually 25%. Western economies are aging. Western societies are rapidly aging, very bad for economic growth. After all that, well, I think you need some good news. And this is very good news for medical technology. So this is Brandon Baptiste, and he was born with sickle cell anemia. But he now appears to have been totally cured through gene technology. And this involved actually altering his DNA. So a team at Boston Children's Hospital took a sample of his blood stem cells. They then used CRISPR gene editing technology to correct the genetic mutation that causes the disease. They then gave Brandon chemotherapy to kill all his existing blood stem cells before re-injecting him with the new ones. Quote, "In my opinion, I'm perfect. I never felt fine before. Before, fine was moderate pain I could take deep breaths through. Now I'm more than fine. I'm operating in every possible way. I used to try to exercise, but every little movement would cause joint pain, and exhaustion would also cause pain. Now I'm going to the gym every day doing cardio and weightlifting," and he certainly looks healthy. So great news for people with genetic diseases. CRISPR gene editing technology can make everything okay. Okay, on to equities. Mixed week. So the all world was down 0.3%, but cut in UK interest rates meant the all share was up 1.5%, up 5.6% year to date, despite the Eurozone economy being rubbish. It was The stock market was up 2.5% over the last couple of weeks, up 7.5% year to date. DeepSeek has had a bad effect on the US market over the past couple of weeks, down 1.5% for the S&P 500, down 2.6% for the Nasdaq. The Hang Seng seems to be defying fears of a global trade war, which would hit the Chinese economy, up 5.2% over the last couple of weeks. Bitcoin fading, sterling flat, the euro down slightly, down 1.2% over the past couple of weeks. So this is the all-world index. Is that a topping formation for now, at least? The all share had a good run on the back of UK interest rate cuts. Euro stocks having a really good run. S&P 500 actually pretty flattish now for a couple of months. Is that a topping formation finally? The Nasdaq unable to hold the 20,000 level. Russell 2000 likewise going nowhere for a few months now, well down from its highs. Hang Seng bull market back on. Topics going nowhere. Bitcoin pausing. Sterling going nowhere over the last couple of weeks, down 0.9% on the year. The euro structurally weak. If the ECB is forced to continue cutting rates, then euro is likely to be weak. Dollar index was up 0.5%. The Fed paused where all the other central banks were cutting. VIX subdued. Quote from Peter Lynch: far more money has been lost by investors in preparing for corrections or anticipating corrections than has been lost in the corrections themselves. And in this cycle, that is all too true for yours truly. I believed that there would be a recession. There wasn't, and that's cost me a lot of money, both in absolute terms and frankly in relative terms, relative to the stock market, which has gone through the roof. Everyone remains bullish tech. Now, this was done before DeepSeek. I wonder what the results would be if you ask them again. But January was positive. January tends to be positive for the entire year. Short interest in the stock market is very low. Everyone remains confident about the outlook for equities. Punters have been piling into ETFs at the start of the year. Mentions of optimism in CEO calls are at all-time high in Q4. Everyone's very optimistic about what Donald Trump could achieve for US growth. Let's see whether that happens. But in the coming years, the growth rate of the Mag 7 is forecast to decline towards average. Therefore, their valuations should decline towards average, he says. And in Q1, Mag 7's earnings were disappointing, leading to a sell-off in, for example, Google and Tesla. Only Meta had a good earnings season. Their total market cap for the Mag 7 fell 625 billion last week. And is that a topping formation? We've said this before. I've said it quite a few times now. And investor sentiment is falling even as economic sentiment is rising. Reminder, equities are very expensive on lots of metrics. Reminder, US equities are very expensive on lots of metrics. So according to Elliott Wave, they are the most overvalued they've ever been, including 1929. But there are signs the omnibubble is starting to deflate. Fartcoin, its price has gone down, what's that, 80% since its peak. Market cap just 500 million now. Trump coin, likewise, its price is fading. Now, Tesla So Elon Musk has taken a sharp turn to the right, which has undermined the attractiveness of his cars to lots of EV buyers who are very green and of the left. So you'll see in January, Tesla sales were down 63% in France, down 60% in Germany, 40% in Sweden, etc. Tesla's shares, having run up very strongly post-election, are falling again. Have they finally peaked? We've said that many times before. Now, going back to our conversation about DeepSeek, the reason the Mag 7 have been so strong is that they have natural monopolies, and this is the percentage of US adults who have Amazon Prime accounts. 75%. DeepSeek AI has shown that AI will not be a natural monopoly. Okay, on to commodities and quick summary. Oil was weak, drifting off again. Natural gas in Europe was sadly very strong. Industrial metals, copper and iron was strong, mixed elsewhere. Precious metals, gold, silver and platinum were all strong. So energy, Brent had a very poor couple of weeks, down 5% and basically flat on the year. European natural gas, terrible, up 13% over the past couple of weeks, up 10% on the year. That feeds through to inflation and is not a good form of inflation, if there is any, in that will feed through to people's living standards. That means they will be diverting spending from consumption on discretionary goods to spending on heating their homes, reduce discretionary spending, and is inherently deflationary unless there is an offsetting increase in their wages, which a weak labour market should help prevent. US natural gas prices fell 14% over the same period, down 9% on the year. Coal continues to fall. Uranium continues to fall. So this is Brent. Euphoria at the start of the year has faded. Reminder, the IEA is saying that the oil markets will be in surplus throughout the year. WTI, again, flat on the year now. So numbers specific to the oil market. Well, despite the falls in the oil price, US crude inventories actually have been falling and falling quite sharply over the last couple of weeks. They're now down almost 20 million barrels since the start of the year, i.e. the first month of the year. Not good. The US oil market is undersupplied. Of course, disruption to any crude flows from Canada would not be helpful. US crude production is flat on the week, down slightly on the year, which is pretty normal at this time of year due to cold weather. Baker Hughes rig count is rising again, up 2 over the last couple of weeks, down 2 since the start of the year, really going nowhere. And the EIA is forecasting that US oil production growth will slow dramatically in the coming years, rising by just 100,000 barrels a day in 2026. Then, unless there are cuts in consumption, the oil market will fall back into balance, and structurally you'll go from having this excess over the last few years to moving into deficits, and that will be very bullish for the oil price. But not yet. We're talking about next year, year after. Now, sadly, European natural gas prices are on an absolute tear, having doubled since last March. And having colder weather, which has driven up demand, and that has meant European gas storage, which was at record highs going into winter, have fallen now to 51%, down from 69% a year ago. Winter's been unexpectedly cold, and obviously we're having reduced pipeline flows from Russia, which means we're very dependent on LNG. So we're going to have to refill those stocks during the summer months. Meanwhile, China has imposed a 15% tariff on US LNG imports, which hopefully should be good for European gas flows as demand in China should fall, diverting cargoes towards Europe. This is UK natural gas futures, again, awful, doubled since last year. Bad for inflation. US natural gas futures, though, appear to have peaked so far, unless there's another cold snap. Coal prices continuing to plummet. Uranium prices fading again. The bottleneck in uranium is not yellow cake, it is in processed uranium. The good news, though, is that China is really doing the energy transition and has built a lot of new nuclear power stations, and that will reduce their reliance on coal. Germany's energy policy is even more idiotic than ours, I'd say, and that is quite an achievement. Onto industrial metals, so mixed week. Aluminium flat, copper up 5.5%, up 15% on the year. So Dr. Copper is diagnosing a cyclical upturn in the manufacturing sector. Iron ore up 5%, up 2.7% on the year. All that's good. Lithium flat, neodymium up, mixed, tin up. Cobalt fell 11.3%. Now I prepared a segment on cobalt, which hopefully we'll have time to do next week. But there's so much going on in the world that a lot of these that we're having to prioritize other things as they arise. But I'll eventually get around to that segment on cobalt. Bottom line, cobalt price going nowhere anytime soon. So this is aluminium, stable but not rising. Cobalt collapsing and going nowhere. Copper rising quickly. Iron ore, stable, not collapsing. Lithium, going nowhere. Neodymium, rising again. The Chinese have threatened to reduce rare earth metal exports to the US. Nickel, going nowhere. Tin, rising again from its lows in November. Zinc, going nowhere. Onto precious metals. Gold has been a huge beneficiary of all this uncertainty. Up 3% on the week. Silver following it. Platinum also joining in. All had a very strong start to the year. PGMs, not so much. So this is gold. Got decisively broken through the $2,800 an ounce mark, up 9% on the year. And everyone's buying gold. This is India. So Indian jewelry demand has actually recovered strongly in 2024. Silver also having a good start to the year, but this is not the same looking chart as gold. Gold is a currency metal. Silver is partly an industrial metal. So safe haven buying is concentrated in gold. Platinum going nowhere. Rhodium going nowhere. Palladium going nowhere. On to rates. So thankfully, the sell-off in long bonds appears to have peaked for now, and we've had a bit of a rally at the long end. So reminder, in the long term, bond inflation break-evens tend to follow oil prices, and oil prices have been coming down. Will that lead to long bond yields coming down in the coming months as the oil price fades? So this chart shows US GDP growth and the 10-year Treasury yield between 1962 and 2019. And you can see that there's a decent correlation between interest rates and nominal GDP growth. As nominal GDP growth rises, so yields rise, and the converse is true. Now, in the UK, I still expect low UK economic growth to translate into lower UK interest rates in the medium term. Obviously, in the short term, UK inflation is going to surge again, which will mean nominal GDP growth surging. But medium term, UK GDP growth is awful, and inflation will head down towards the 2% target, which will mean interest rates follow it. Now, the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been talking about how the Trump administration wants interest rates down, but he's clarified that by saying they're focused on yields in the market, especially the 10-year yield, rather than the Fed funds rate. And so is it any coincidence that we've had a bit of a rally in the US 10-year? I'll take you through the chart in a second. But as we talked about earlier, the US needs to sell a record $10 trillion worth of bonds this year. That means frequent large treasury auctions. Will the market be able to absorb all that flow? And this is what they're planning to do. Auction sizes for the various different durations of bonds, and you'll see that they're concentrated on the 5-year and what's that, the 2-year, 7-year and 2-year. There are a lot of people who are very bearish on US long bonds. Now, are they right? In which case, long bonds will sell off, or when you get that concentrated short interest, you tend to get very sharp snapbacks where any fall in yield will cause speculators to have to buy in, to have to call in their shorts, leading to short, sharp rallies in long bonds. That's the danger. Okay, so the UK 2-year has actually rallied quite sharply over the last month, down from a peak of 4.6%, which always seemed frankly delusional to me, to 4.2% as of Friday. This is the 10-year, still at 4.5%, seems very high by historic standards. 30-year, still at 5.06%, which is much better than it was, but still extraordinarily high, given that the interest rate currently is 4.5%. So there's a 50 basis point premium for the 30-year. So essentially, the UK bond market is locking in restrictive monetary policy, more restrictive than current interest rates, for 30 years. Seems absolutely daft to me. US 10-year is at 4.5%, down from its peak, but still high. As in October, it was at 3.6%. Similar rally in German 10-year, French, Italian, Greek. Okay, concluding comments. Well, this chart shows economic policy uncertainty, and it is shot through the roof. So it's been a very long episode this week because there's a hell of a lot going on in the world. I mean, Donald Trump is making a lot of noise. It is not clear to me yet that he's actually achieving very much. Everywhere, Donald Trump, DOGE are talking a great fight. But when you look at what they've actually achieved, it is really not that much. A lot of things they talk about, such as taking over Gaza, seem purely delusional, and a lot of things DOGE is talking about, such as saving the US government $1 billion a day. Well, when you dig into it, I just can't see how they're remotely close to that. And a lot of things like buying out 60,000 federal employees, well, the courts have blocked that, and they seem to be blocking a lot of the initiatives. So a lot of rhetoric which is upsetting the markets and creating a lot of uncertainty. But watch this space. Will they actually achieve very much? So unfortunately, Richard has got to go. We will hopefully have a full update next time. I have benefited from the rally in long bonds and am well off my lows, but it's still been an absolutely appalling trade. But aside, so regular viewers will know that my father was very ill and he died before Christmas, and I've been dealing with a lot of the aftermath of that, memorials, etc. And the thing is, made me really appreciate is you can't take it with you. So actually, I'm not feeling very conservative about my finances. I think I've actually got to spend it. So I'll be going skiing some more. So we'll fit in the next one. When I'm back from skiing, I'm skiing this week. I hope you are all having a good time. Hope you're all doing better than me. Not difficult, but we carry on. And so thank you all for watching. And please can you press like and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you next time. It's goodbye from me, Keith Jordan. Goodbye.
Full disclaimer. The material and information contained in this podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only and should not be relied upon for making a business, legal or any other decision. We may own or have a financial interest in any securities mentioned. Listeners should conduct their own research or consult a professional investment advisor before making any decisions regarding topics mentioned on the show. Whilst we endeavour to ensure that the information presented on the show is correct, we make no representations or warranties of any kind, express or implied, with respect to the podcast and website or to any information, products, services or related graphics discussed or presented in the podcast or website. Any reliance you place on such material is strictly at your own risk. You are solely responsible for the investment decisions you make. We will not be responsible for any errors or omissions in the podcast or website, including in articles or postings, for hyperlinks embedded in messages, or for any results obtained from the use of such information, nor will we be liable for any loss or damage, including consequential damages, if any, caused by a reader's reliance on any information provided by the podcast or website. Please do not listen to the podcast if you do not accept self-responsibility for your actions.